long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. My guest today is Lane Kenworthy, a professor of sociology at UC San Diego. Now, I previously talked to him before on the show about his book, Social Democratic America, and I think that was a great conversation. And so when I heard he had a new book out, I was really looking forward to reading it, and I hoped he'd be willing to come back on the show. And obviously he was, and so today I am pleased to be talking to him about his latest book, Social Democratic Capitalism. Lane Kenworthy, welcome back.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
So I want to start with the real basics. And your basic argument, at least as I saw it after I finished the book, was that there are certain fundamental things that once people get to a certain level of desire, that they are a level of affluence they desire. And that's protection from loss, fairness, and liberty. These are these sort of the three fundamentals, would you say?
They are, but it's important to note that here I'm drawing on prior research, especially by Ronald Inglehart, a political scientist, and a lot of his collaborators, that find that these are things that people tend to emphasize or put higher on their priority list as their society gets richer. The way Inglehart frames it is that as we move past a situation of scarcity, or at least perceived scarcity, so that we no longer are worried, or at least many people in a society are no longer worried about, whether they're going to have a roof over their head and food on the table, or being able to basically support their family. We all along have these desires to try to minimize loss, or at least the cost of loss when it happens. Caring about others, caring about fairness in the society, altruistic motives, in other words, and then also caring about personal liberty. But as societies get richer, these things become more and more important. And so over time, at least in a democratic country, you're more likely to see them generate things like social policies, a welfare state, in other words, variety of policies that promote fairness and equality of opportunity, and also on lots of social and cultural issues, a turn toward more personal liberty or personal freedom.
Yeah. And when I was thinking about these basic things, these, I think Engelhardt calls them post-materialist values, that it seemed to me that there was maybe a fourth thing that I would add in, and that's prosperity. I mean, because it seems to me that even when people have enough to live comfortably, that whole issue of hedonic adaptation, and, how humans are, is that we always want more. So maybe it's different in the sense that it's always there as opposed to just after we get to a certain level of prosperity. But would you agree that that's another basic, at least in that sense?
I suspect you're right about that is something that we see pretty constantly across human societies, but it doesn't play a role in the book. And as you just said, I'm not sure whether we have evidence about whether that is something that only appears in kind of Englehart post-scarcity or post-materialist situation, or whether it's something that is always there. I'm just not sure.
Actually, I like your use of the terms post-scarcity much more, because I always felt like post-materialist somehow sounds like we've transcended materialism in some way. And that really, I think that's a much more, post-scarcity it seems to me a better way to kind of formulate that.
Yeah, I think maybe so. I mean, I don't like to get too hung up on terminology.
Sure.
And Englehart's, I think he uses the term post-materialist in part because one of the things he observes is that as voters, we no longer tend to be as strongly guided by what are our presumed material interests. So in other words, people who are less educated, lower income, for a good bit of the 20th century in countries like the United States, often tend to devote their economic interests. And we see that diminishing a bit later. And I don't know, that may be one of the reasons why Englehart settled on this term post-materialism. But I'm not sure. I do think post-scarcity is fine.
And so the reason I bring up these basic things is because it seems to me if we can agree that these are important needs that people have, then the question naturally becomes, well, what sort of system will best allow people to achieve those goals, those needs, that sort of thing. And the argument that you're making, not just in this book, I would say, but in your previous book on Social Democratic America, is that it's actually social democratic capitalism. Now, the problem with that term, I think, well, not so much a problem, but I think people have sort of poured their own meaning into that term. And so it can be defined in a lot of ways. And I think it's important then to talk about what you mean by it. And in the book, you point at 6 core elements of social democratic capitalism, 6 things sort of fundamental to it. And I thought maybe we could talk about each of those things, at least briefly. What are these elements of what you see as a social democratic system? And the first one, I believe, was democracy, right?
That's right. Political democracy. And I think here maybe it's useful to separate the 6 into 2 groups, okay, because it's really, I think that political democracy, basically capitalist economy, and good universal elementary and secondary education, or K through 12 education, I think those are important. Without them, the model wouldn't make much sense and probably wouldn't achieve the outcomes that I conclude it does. But at the same time, I don't think these are things that play a significant role in distinguishing among the world's rich, longstanding democratic countries, which are the countries that I focus on. So I'm really trying to figure out what are the institutions and policies that yield good outcomes, like the ones we were just talking about, in this particular context where a society is pretty affluent, where it has a political democracy. And so capitalism, democracy, and good education, I do think are critical, but they're not important in distinguishing among the set of countries. The 4th, 5th, and 6th elements, I do think vary a lot and in particularly significant ways across this set of countries. So the 4th, yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, go ahead, please. Yeah. So you're right on the same line I was thinking. So please go ahead.
Sure. So the 4th is a strong, generous, comprehensive set of public insurance programs, or welfare state programs, as they're often called. And here we see a lot of variation, although I think it's worth stressing that all of these countries, including the United States, which is frequently referred to as a welfare state laggard, or sometimes characterized as not really having a welfare state at all, I think that's wrong. We don't have one that's as generous and broad in scope in terms of the kinds of risks or losses that it covers as the leading countries like the Nordic nations. But we do have a pretty well-developed welfare state. It's certainly much, much different than what existed 100 years ago. So this is best thought of as a continuum rather than a kind of categorical either or, yes or no type of difference. So the 4th is these public insurance programs. The 5th is a characteristic of modern social democratic capitalism, or the Nordic model, and that's a heavy emphasis on employment. So a generation ago, maybe in the late 1960s through perhaps the early 1980s, it was, I think, fairly common for social democrats and others on the left, or those who believed in the value of a big welfare state, especially in Western Europe, to think that these societies were heading in the direction of fewer and fewer people in paid employment. Automation was going to take over most of the jobs. And in any case, it would be a good thing if we could reduce work, which nobody really liked. That view has very much gone by the wayside in social democratic or social democratic capitalist thinking. People now tend to attach much more value to paid employment. None of this is to say that all paid work is great or that everybody should be in employment. But employment does have a lot of value. It does a lot of good things for individuals and also for societies. And especially important here is paying for those public insurance programs. In the modern context of a globalized economy where It's not too difficult for people and companies to move their money around. There's some pressure on tax systems, so it's more difficult to increase tax rates. And so in order to pay for a generous welfare state, it helps to have a lot of people in employment, so you can tax their earnings. So for this reason, public or government services that make it easier for people to work, and here I'm thinking of things like childcare, paid parental leave, and also active labor market policy, retraining, job placement programs, this type of thing. These turn out to be really critical. And then the sixth element serves the same purpose, and this is moderate or modest rather than very stringent regulation of product and labor markets. All of these countries have some basic regulations that protect worker safety, consumer safety, and so on. But the Nordic countries in particular, and Denmark is kind of the leader here, have found that if you make these things too stringent, if you, for example, make it too difficult for employers to hire and fire people, then you end up discouraging employment. And so you can do just fine with a lot of cushions with these public insurance programs, but allowing a fair amount of flexibility in labor and product markets. So these fifth and sixth elements get you high employment. The fourth element, the public insurance programs, are very good at helping the poor and assuring income security. And so together, this package, I conclude, seems to be pretty effective at getting good outcomes.
And I think it's important to point out that as you mentioned, that these aren't really binaries; they're all on a continuum. Because I know plenty of people on the progressive left would say, well, we don't have a real democracy here in the United States. It's sort of a, oligarchy of that sort. But I mean, so you're talking about where countries have to at least get to some basic level of all six of these things, and some are going to be better than others in various categories.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't want to diminish or suggest that there are no differences across these countries in their type of political system or even their degree of democracy. We certainly have some problems here in the United States, very fundamental ones, from the fact that we have a winner-take-all rather than proportional representation electoral system to others. And the same is true for capitalism itself and also for elementary and secondary education systems. It's just that in terms of understanding why these countries do better or worse on things like poverty, income security, equality of opportunity, the kinds of outcomes that I emphasize, it really is the fourth, fifth, and sixth elements that I just talked about that I think are the distinguishing factors. And
it occurs to me, and just our talking about this, that at least one of them, and maybe a couple actually, can differ not just between countries, but within regions, or in the U.S. model within states, because certainly the quality of K through 12 education varies enormously, as do public insurance programs based on, because the United States has a federal system as opposed to other countries which have more of a unitary system for these things.
Yeah, that's right. And when it comes to public insurance programs, this federalism here in the United States is increasingly important. It's become more difficult in the last generation to get new policies enacted or major expansions of policies enacted. Things like the Affordable Care Act are more the exception than the rule in the period since roughly 1980 or so. But because we do allow a fair amount of leeway for states and also cities and other local government agencies to some degree do their own thing, we've seen states like California, Washington, Oregon, New York, Massachusetts jump out ahead in the last couple of decades with things like expansion of access to health care, paid parental leave policies, new types of pensions, and also, although it's not a focus of the book, not by any means trivially, environmental regulations. So yeah, this can matter, especially in the United States, but it's true in some other countries as well, like Germany and Switzerland. There's a fair amount of federalism there too.
And this is, in a way, when I was reading through these, thinking about these basic aspects of it, that, well, In a way, it seems like it's something that only rich countries need apply in a sense in that getting all these things really requires a certain basic level of national wealth. And so, for instance, expecting all of these things to be present in, say, a lot of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa is probably at this point maybe asking more than a little bit too much, right?
I suspect that's true. It's not something that I've actually researched, and so it's not a conclusion I reach in the book. But I strongly suspect that that it's true, that you're unlikely to see a comprehensive set of public insurance programs and a very generous, wide-ranging set of employment-oriented services in a country that's quite poor. This would be, causally, we expect it to come only when countries get to this post-scarcity level, when they get much more affluent. But you could imagine a government in a relatively poor country saying, look, I think the Nordic model works great. Let's give it a shot and do what we can. I just suspect it's much less likely to be present there. As to whether it would work or not, I don't really have any firm conclusions. I'm a bit skeptical, but I'd want to see what the evidence says.
I would think that there'd be some other issues involving rule of law and strength of institutions and things like that are probably going to play an important role in developing that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
And so, but that aside, there are still plenty of countries that, if they chose to, have the requisite level of wealth and development to look to social democratic capitalism. In the book, a number of times you refer to the 20 richest countries, but it seems to me that there could be maybe twice as many countries that conceivably, if they had the political will, could say, well, let's turn to a social democratic capitalism model. Does that seem reasonable or about right?
I do think that's probably true. Again, it's not a focus of the book, but I do think that countries in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, some Latin American nations, and a few in Asia, maybe South Africa, all have this certainly as a potential option, either right now or in the not too distant future. And part of the reason for me at least doing this kind of research is not only to inform the United States, although that is my kind of principal interest, but exactly as you suggest, to think about other countries that might be thinking about, as we get richer or as we move from middle income to semi-rich status, what kind of policy setup do we want to think about adopting?
Right. And to inform those decisions, naturally, what policymakers and politicians and even the public would want to know as well, is there a good case to be made that social democratic capitalism can meet these needs that people have? And if we go back to those sort of 3 or 4 basic things, you'd need to show or try to make a convincing case that social democratic capitalist countries do provide more fairness, more loss protection, more liberty, and ideally more prosperity. And so I thought maybe we could start with fairness. What evidence is there that social democratic capitalist systems are fairer than other systems in rich countries?
Yeah, so for fairness, I focus on 2 particular outcomes, and here I draw heavily on John Rawls' approach in his book, A Theory of Justice. And so just to back up for a second, so these 3 things that we talked about at the outset that Engelhardt and others have found become more important to people as their societies get richer. That's an empirical regularity that turns out to be true. It doesn't mean that those are necessarily things that we would desire in a good society. I mean, I think, as it happens, most of us would. But so rather than using those as the outcomes that I focus on, I turn to Rawls. Not that Rawls was necessarily right, but I tend to be a kind of loose Rawlsian, and certainly his approach has been quite influential over the last half century or so. So Rawls says, what would we want in a good society? And he's got a particular philosophical setup that a framework that he uses to decide these things. But in any case, one of the things is equality of opportunity. Another is the best possible living standards for the least well off. And so when it comes to fairness, I focus on those two outcomes. For best possible living standards for the least well-off, I look at incomes, at absolute incomes at the low end of the distribution, as it happens, the 10th percentile, because we have good data on this. I also look at an indicator of material hardship or material deprivation. Increasingly, governments these days, to supplement information that we get by looking at people's earnings and incomes, they ask a variety of questions about your quality of life, things about your living conditions. Did you need to go to a doctor but decided not to because you couldn't afford it? Were you unable to pay your bills last month? These kinds of things. So I look at an indicator of deprivation. And then I also look at an indicator of relative poverty, which is far and away the most commonly used measure among comparative poverty researchers. And in all cases, there's a strong correlation between the size and scope of the welfare state and then also employment rates, these two things that are really at the core of social democratic capitalism and success on these particular outcomes. For equality of opportunity, we don't really have a direct measure. There's no such thing. Equality of opportunity, most of us would think as something like everybody around age 20, 21, when you're, or at least most people are more or less done with schooling, has a roughly equivalent shot at success in terms of material well-being in life. And there's really no simple or straightforward indicator there. So a lot of social scientists use a measure of what's called relative intergenerational or between generation mobility. That's basically just where you end up on the income ladder relative or compared to where your parents were. And if most people in a country end up in roughly the same position, if your parents were, say, in the bottom 20%, you tend to end up in the bottom 20%. And those whose parents were in the top 10% or so tend to end up in the top 10% in their adult life. Then we conclude that probably there's not that much equality of opportunity in the society. Where you end up is too strongly determined by your situation as a child. So it's not a perfect measure, but it's about as good as we can do, probably. Unfortunately, here we don't have good measures for all of the countries, but for the 12 or so that we do, it looks very much like social democratic capitalism is good for equality of opportunity, tends to allow people a better shot at shifting position compared to where their parents were.
One thing that I've always, I guess, appreciated from my understanding of Rawls, which is, I'll admit, somewhat limited, but the sort of thought experiment way of thinking about it, and that idea of if you didn't know what your position in society would be, and that find that veil of ignorance, what sort of society, what sort of system would you design? And to me, that sort of enlightens makes me look at structures in a very different way than just saying, well, what's best for me, knowing where I'm at now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the device that Rawls uses, and from that he concludes that rational humans in that original position or behind that veil of ignorance, as he calls it, would end up choosing to prioritize basic liberties, the best possible living standards for the least well-off, and equality of opportunity.
Yeah.
And I'll just mention here that I'm pretty convinced that if Rawls were writing today, so he wrote this book mainly in the 1950s and 1960s, and it's published in 1971, we've learned a lot about human aversion to loss since then. And so I'm quite convinced that if Rawls were writing today, he would add income security, or more broadly, economic security, to that list that people would decide to prioritize. And one other thing I'll mention here is that the whole point of looking to Rawls or maybe to some other philosophical approach is because there are so many outcomes that we can think about that might be desirable in a good society. And no particular institutional or policy setup is going to be best on all of them. So I think it's worth simplifying a bit and saying, okay, are there any that we might choose to prioritize above others? And, by others, I mean things like community or trust or happiness or health and on and on and on. And so, rightly or wrongly, I think Rawls is a pretty useful starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, you can use other starting points as well. Some people would say, well, you can use the teachings of, say, Christianity or other things like that. But I think it helps to have that sort of construct in place to think about these things. You mentioned loss aversion and research on that, and really the extent to which today we know how much more loss averse people are than maybe we used to think. And so let's talk about that for a minute. I mean, what does the comparison look like here when we're looking at the social democratic capitalist countries as opposed to rich countries that aren't, in terms of how well they help to protect people from those sort of significant losses?
Yeah, so we now, and this is quite recent, but we now have indicators, at least for all of these rich democratic nations, or nearly all of them, for what I think is a pretty good, not a perfect, but a pretty good measure of income security. So what you do is you take any household in which an adult from one year to the next experiences what we'll call a large earnings loss. And let's just say arbitrarily that that's 20 or 25% of your earnings. So if you're earning $40,000 in year one and in year two your earnings are $30,000 or less, we'll call that a large earnings loss. And the indicator here is the average loss in household income among households where one adult experiences that kind of earnings loss. And so the idea here is that if we have a broad and generous set of public insurance programs, one or more of them is likely to kick in when an individual experiences that kind of earning loss. Let's say you get fired from your job or your company goes under, so you collect unemployment insurance. You get an injury or suffer some kind of disability, so maybe you go on a disability program, or you're sick for an extended period of time, or you decide to take time off to have a child or spend time with that child, so you get paid parental leave. So the variety, or you retire, so you get a public pension. The variety of programs that kick in and soften the loss to household income that would otherwise occur from this loss of individual earnings. Another way that households can alleviate this loss is that a second earner steps up and either increases his or her work hours or takes a job in the first place if they weren't in paid work before. So these are two pretty useful ways to reduce the degree of income loss. Welfare state programs and adding employment. And as it happens, those are precisely the two types of things that social democratic capitalism is really good at. And so maybe not surprisingly, we see a very strong correlation between a social democratic capitalism index that I create and smaller household income losses when there's an earnings loss.
And, I think to this point, even a lot of listeners from the right of center would say, well, okay, sure, but, and here's the but thing, even if we agree or admit that social democratic capitalism is, in the way you're talking about it, fairer, more equal, and that it protects better from loss, it comes at a cost. And the common argument is that, well, the cost is in terms of both less liberty and less overall prosperity. And, those are, I think, very important claims to think about. And so maybe we could talk about those a little bit, starting with that idea of liberty as you increase the safety net and increase the fairness in the system, there's this inevitable loss of liberty.
Right. I think this is a reasonable objection. Many on the left historically have said, well, that may or may not be true, but in any case, we think these other goals, low poverty, maybe not too much inequality, equality of opportunity, and so on, are just more important than liberty. But whether you take that view or not, I think it's important to look at what data we have to see if, in fact, it's true that there's a trade-off, and if so, what's the magnitude of that trade-off. And so I draw here on a couple of economic and personal freedom indexes that have been created mostly by researchers in fairly conservative think tanks like the Fraser Institute or Cato Institute or Heritage Foundation. And it turns out that when you look across these rich democratic countries, there just isn't any evidence of a trade-off between being higher on the social democratic capitalism index and the degree of economic or personal freedom. And it turns out that the same thing is true for economic growth, the main indicator that people who invoke the possibility of a trade-off between maybe generosity and prosperity. So here we've got data for most of these countries going back 150 years or so. We can look over time within these countries. We can compare across the countries. We can do a kind of quasi-experimental thing where we look at change in social democratic capitalism and change in economic growth. And none of these approaches yield any kind of evidence of a sacrifice or trade-off of economic growth among countries that score higher on the social democratic capitalism index.
Which I think, I was going to say, I think that's a surprise to a lot of folks because the common, the conventional wisdom, I guess you could say, in some circles is that, well, the trade-off is basically if you have, high taxes, all these regulations and strong labor unions and all that kind of stuff, you're inevitably going to have a less dynamic, more slowly growing economy. But what you're saying, what your research has found is that just doesn't seem to hold true when you're looking at, a large number of countries over time.
Yeah, that's right. Theoretically, it's very plausible that this is true. And in fact, I strongly suspect that there is some level of welfare state generosity, for example,
sure,
at which you would begin to observe a trade-off. But the Nordic countries, which are the ones that score highest on this index, that have most fully implemented this model, in other words, tend to be around 55% of GDP in terms of their overall taxation and spending. And when we're looking at public social programs, it's around 30% of GDP. And so the most reasonable conclusion, I think, from this real world experience is that whatever that level is at which you would begin to observe a trade-off, it's probably higher than 55% of GDP.
And I think you can even make an argument, at least when it comes to liberty, that you could potentially have more liberty in a social democratic capitalist system. And what I mean is, I guess, I'm referring to that distinction. I think it was Isaiah Berlin who first made it between positive and negative liberty. And when we're talking about positive liberty, giving people the capabilities to do things and lead fulfilling lives, you can make an argument that there's actually more of that in social democratic capitalist system without that necessary trade-off in negative liberty, or that much of a trade-off in negative liberty, which is government just basically staying out of your life, essentially.
I think that's exactly right. In fact, I use one indicator. It's not a perfect one, but it's not terrible either to try to look at this. And in the book, I think about it partly in the context of opportunity, because I think we can conceptualize Berlin's positive liberty as something akin to opportunity, or what Amartya Sen referred to as capabilities or capacities to decide and choose and pursue whatever it is we want to achieve in life. So there's a question that the Gallup World Poll has been asking for the last 10 years or so that says, how satisfied are you with your freedom to choose what you want to do with your life? And so I take the share of the population that answers, it's a yes or no question, that answers yes to that question as a kind of rough indicator or proxy for positive freedoms. And there is, in fact, a strong positive correlation across these countries between their score on the social democratic capitalism index and the share of the population saying, yes, I'm satisfied.
Yeah. Which is not to say that there's no trade-off, because obviously, other things being equal, most people would rather be taxed less and regulated less and so forth. But I guess the argument that I'm thinking of, it would make sense as a person of the left especially, is that that's more than made up for by the gain in overall positive liberty.
Yeah, I think that's right. And here I should acknowledge that if one's view of freedom is purely about how much you pay in taxes, then it's clearly the case that there is a trade-off here. Because in order to pay for these programs, not just the public insurance programs, but also the services that are good for promoting employment, supporting employment, In order to do that, you need to raise more money. And so if you have that kind of very narrow conceptualization of freedom, then yes, there is a trade-off. But on these broader indices or indicators of economic or personal freedom, that there isn't any apparent trade-off.
Now, you've mentioned the Nordic countries a lot because they are sort of the model of social democratic capitalism. And it seems like that it's a system that's working very well for them. And even if someone were to say, well, okay, I agree that it's working really well in those countries, they're just too different. And that model's not going to travel very well. And it could be for a lot of reasons. They're smaller, their population is more similar, or, a bunch of things. And you look at this issue of generalizability in the book, you spend a lot of time discussing it. And what did you find there?
Yeah, so here too, I think the hypothesis that skeptics bring here is a very reasonable one. It is the case that the countries that have most fully implemented this model are very strong and homogenous, and they may be different from other rich democratic nations in a host of ways that make it possible for them to adopt this model without suffering trade-offs. I don't think, given the evidence, that there's too much reason to object or be skeptical of the idea that a bigger welfare state and higher employment will get you less poverty and maybe more equality of opportunity. But the skepticism here is about whether other countries, like, say, the United States, could adopt this model. Many would acknowledge that we would have less poverty, let's say, and perhaps more equality of opportunity, more income security. But the worry is that here, unlike in, say, Sweden or Finland or Denmark, there would be trade-offs. Fewer people would decide to work, and so we get less economic growth. Or maybe because we're a much larger country, more diverse in terms of our racial and ethnic makeup, the policy simply wouldn't work as well. And so I do try to work through, as best I can with existing evidence in one of the chapters in the book, each of these hypotheses having to do with work ethic, maybe intelligence, trust, solidarity, population size, homogeneity, and so on. And what I conclude is there really isn't much reason to think that this model wouldn't work just as well in bigger countries. And let me just say, with respect, the two most common versions of this point to country size and homogeneity. Yeah. And it turns out that what most people who raise this objection, what they're really thinking about is not actually whether the model would work well in the United States, but whether we're likely to adopt it. It is very much the case that smaller countries historically have been more likely to put this set of policies and institutions in place. And it probably is the case that it's easier to do that in a small nation, also in a homogenous nation. But that's a very different question from whether the model, if it were adopted and put in place in a larger, more heterogeneous country, would work well. And it turns out that there's no real correlation between small country size, small population, and success on any of the outcomes that I look at, nor is it the case that homogenous countries tend to achieve faster growth or other things that we might worry about having to trade off if we adopt this social democratic capitalist model. So in any case, I guess the best thing to say is that if you're really interested, if your listeners are really interested in these objections, maybe take a look at the chapter. Yeah.
No, absolutely. In fact, that one of the frustrating things about talking, this is the same frustration in a way I had with Social Democratic America, not with the book, but with our conversation, is that there's so much in there, and you back up your arguments with so much good research that we can only really scratch the surface. And so absolutely, I hope listeners will take a look at the book, because I felt that I had some of those very questions about the Nordic countries, and I felt that they were very, very clearly and thoroughly addressed in there. So let's talk a little bit about specifically the United States. Now, you mentioned that, countries are on a continuum in terms of how far along this path they are. Where would you rate sort of I guess you call it the progress of the United States compared to the Nordic countries along this road of social democratic capitalism? How do we stand here?
Well, to my mind, the simplest way to think about this is using a kind of crude indicator of the scope and generosity of the welfare state. But it's nonetheless not a bad one, and it's one for which we've got data that go back a good bit over time. And so if you just look at the share of GDP that's spent by the government on various types of welfare state programs, it's roughly zero in all of these countries in the late 1900s. Here in the United States, we had Civil War, widows' pensions, but essentially that was the sum total of our welfare state. So it begins to rise quite dramatically in the 1930s, as most people know, and in most of these countries has continued to go up fairly steadily since then, with kind of a bigger jump in the 1960s and slower growth since around 1980 or so, and in some countries, no growth at all since 1980. But if you look at this particular indicator, here in the United States, we've gone in the last 100 years from 0 to about 20% of our GDP spent on these types of programs. The Nordic countries have gone from 0 to about, and these are the leading countries, they've gone from 0 to about 30%. So if you want to use this as your kind of ballpark estimate, we're about 2/3 of the way to where the contemporary Nordic countries are. But another way to put this, which I think is useful, is to say that, based on that indicator, the contemporary United States is closer to the contemporary Nordic countries than it is to the United States of, say, 1920, a century ago.
And so in GDP terms, then, for the United States to get to this level, we're talking probably about like $2 trillion more roughly in spending on these sort of programs, if my quick back of the envelope math is even close to correct.
Yeah, that's right. About 10% of GDP, or our GDP is currently 20 or so trillion dollars. Well, at least before the COVID crisis.
Yeah.
So yes, that's roughly right.
So in terms of more specific proposals, you have a great chapter called A Better America, where there's this list of things that you believe the United States should be or could potentially improve on. And I counted 21 separate things. So obviously there's no way we can get to all of those. But if you could just pick out maybe, a couple, three that you feel are the most important, that could do the most good in getting us along this road toward, more fairness and protection from loss and that sort of thing, what would they be and why? Yeah,
so I think the first thing I'll say is that I really don't think there is any one or two or three most important. I think all of these would address different, different needs or different failings that we currently have in the United States. Right. But, if pressed to say, if I were a policy czar and could tomorrow implement, let's say, 4 of these, the ones I probably would pick would be, first of all, getting to universal health insurance. There are a lot of different ways to do this. I think the simplest and relatively small in terms of its cost, in terms of adding to our to government spending as a share of GDP, would be to just expand access to Medicare and Medicaid and add a public option that people who don't have health insurance through any other means could get at very low cost. Maybe eventually then merge the various public programs, which would get government more leverage to exert some good cost controls. That's another thing that we really need to do with our healthcare system. But lack of access to health insurance is a really big source of economic insecurity. People, either without health insurance or with inadequate health insurance, can get socked with such a huge bill that it's really just life altering. And so that's an obvious problem.
I should point out, we're kind of alone in the United States in this, because unlike all the other rich countries, this is I think a bad instance of American exceptionalism, when we're the only ones who have this sort of crazy quilt, not everyone covered system.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Starting in the 1960s, many of these countries began moving pretty quickly toward close to 100% coverage through their healthcare system. And the last of these other countries, apart from us, got to it, I believe, in the mid-1980s. So it's been roughly a full generation that we're the only country without it. And, we're now down to only about 10% without any health insurance. But that's something that's so easy to remedy. I don't mean politically, but just in terms of the policy solution. And such an obvious failing that we absolutely should do that. So that's one. A second that I would want to do right away is early education. So put in place a universal, very affordable, high-quality system of childcare and preschools. A couple of states around the country and a few localities like New York City have begun to do this, but mostly just by adding preschool for 4-year-olds, so the 1 year below kindergarten. That's a really good start, but we're not very far along here. And there's now lots of evidence. The Nordic countries, especially Denmark and Sweden and Norway, have had this in place for almost half a century now. And there's not 100% agreement among researchers, but pretty widespread agreement that this is a good thing, not only for making it easier for parents, especially mothers, to get into the labor force and stay in the labor force, but also for equalizing opportunity, for making it easier for kids who come from less advantaged families, neighborhoods, cities, and so on, to have a decent shot in life and be better prepared for K through 12 schooling and beyond. So I would do that, and then I would probably choose two policies or policy changes that would help a lot with income security and with boosting the living standards of the least well-off. I would probably change our child tax credit to a straightforward child benefit, just a cash payment to families, boost it to about $3,000 per child, make it universal. You could tax back a little bit from the very rich if you wanted to save some money, but I would make it a universal program. And then I would alter and expand our earned income tax credit. The EITC is a terrific program, very helpful in terms of boosting or supplementing earnings for people with fairly low earnings without creating any kind of disincentive to enter or expand paid work. What I would do is change it so that it's paid to individuals instead of to households. I would probably boost its level to about $4,000 per person, and I would increase the point in the income distribution at which it begins to taper out, so that a lot more middle class Americans can get it. I would also then tie it to GDP per capita. Right now, it's indexed for inflation, which is a pretty good thing. That means it goes up from year to year without policymakers having to intentionally sit down and say, yeah, let's agree to increase it. But it would be even better if it were tied to the economy rather than just to prices. That would help assure that even middle class families, but also especially working class and poor families, were seeing their incomes rise, even if just a bit, as the economy gets richer.
Of all the things you mentioned, that's the last one, the ITC expansion, that at least seems to have some sort of bipartisan support. At least we've heard talk about it for a while, expanding, and you can always find a handful of Republicans who seem to think it's a good idea, along with most all Democrats. But still, we don't see nearly the sort of progress on that at least I would hope. And on those other things, it becomes, I think, even more difficult, which leads me to, I guess, the last question I have for you is, how optimistic are you? I mean, do you see any way in which the United States, if there is the political will in, a decade or maybe 2 decades to move appreciably along this line and be more social democratic capitalist, not just for the sake of doing that, but obviously to give people these outcomes that, everyone really wants?
Right. In the long run, I'm very optimistic. I think we're probably likely to continue. We, the United States, are probably likely to continue the path we've been on over the last 100 years, where progress happens only intermittently, but when it does happen, it tends to stick. So we very rarely do away with or significantly decrease the generosity of public programs, public social programs. And that's largely because they tend to be so popular, but it's also because our political system makes it hard to change policy at all, both adding it but also subtracting from it. So the mid-1990s welfare reform was one obvious exception to that, but it really is one of very, very few exceptions. So I suspect we're likely to continue on this path. And, if you just draw a little line, in about 50 years or so, you get maybe to us spending about 30% of GDP on these various programs. There's no guarantee that this is going to happen, obviously. But I do think it's more likely than not. I'm not at all optimistic, on the other hand, about the very near term. Even in the midst of this crisis, there's this commonplace view that crises tend to lead to big additions to the welfare state. And that certainly happened during the 1930s, but it turns out the 1930s were much more the exception here than the rule. Most of our other expansions or creations of new social programs have come in good economic times rather than bad economic times. And in fact, the most common denominator here is having a left party in the United States, that's the Democratic Party, in power with a pretty healthy majority at a progressive moment in time. And here I'm, again, not so optimistic about the near term, but long term, I think things look quite good. We're in the midst of this very polarized period where Republicans have adopted, especially in the last 10, 15 years, a very, very oppositional stance. But if you look at the California experience, you see something very similar that happened in the 1990s and into the early 2000s. And immigration, like it is at the national level, was part of the story there, too. California had become very diverse very quickly. There was a lot of uncertainty about that. The state was quite polarized between progressives and conservatives. Nothing was happening. A lot of tough on crime and anti-immigrant policymakers got elected as governors and mayors of some of the bigger cities. And then the state just moved beyond it. Diversity helped in part by increasing the voting support for the Democrats. But also it seems that middle-class white Californians kind of got used to the fact that diversity isn't a terrible thing. It doesn't fundamentally ruin your quality of life. Indeed, there might even be some really good aspects to it. So I think the California experience makes me optimistic. The other thing that makes me really optimistic is what we see in voting patterns among millennials and Generation Z, who are very, very strongly Democratic. Yeah. And there's a pretty common pattern where people tend to, whatever they vote when they're around age 20, they tend to stick with throughout their life. There's no guarantee that that's going to happen, but if it does with these two generations, we're looking at a pretty substantial change in voting patterns coming in about 10 or 20 years.
Yeah. And I would argue from a policy standpoint, one thing that can sort of help to keep those changes in place, if there's the ability to do that, is that universality that you mentioned in regards to, for instance, the not tax credit, but actually the payment, the child payment thing, because it seems that when a program is universal, it becomes much more difficult to scale it back than if it's tied to a certain income that they get it, but I don't get it.
I do think that's right, although I'll say that I've been quite impressed with the degree to which non-universal programs seem to have become very strongly supported here in the United States by the public. And so the EITC is one example of that. It seems to be quite solid politically. But even a program that scholars like me, for the very reason that you mentioned, have always worried about, like Medicaid, seems now to be quite strongly supported, such that it was proved difficult, maybe even impossible, for the Republicans in 2017, 2018, when they had both the House and the Senate and the presidency. They turned out not to be able to pass even just a reduction of the spending that was increased after the Affordable Care Act. So I do think you're right that universal programs politically tend to be on more solid ground. But they're not the only programs that the public comes to like and support.
That is a good shot of optimism, something I think that we can all use a little bit more in these times. So why don't we stop on that optimistic note? Lane Kenworthy, as always, it's been great talking with you. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's it for today's show. We hope you like what you heard. If you'd like a second full-length Politics Guys episode every single week, as opposed to just these occasional interviews, you can get that by becoming a Patreon supporter. Supporters also get ad-free versions of every episode, as well as other good stuff. To get the details and to become a supporter, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. And if you can't afford to become a supporter, email me at mike@politicsguys.com and I will get you full access to that second episode every single week. And if being a monthly supporter is too much of a commitment, but you still like to help us out occasionally, you can do that too through PayPal. You'll find a link on our website, politicsguys.com/support. If you haven't already subscribed to the show, that is a big help, as well as leaving ratings and reviews, and especially sharing your favorite episodes on social media. That's a big deal to us. And if you've got a question, comment, correction, gripe, or whatever, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. For more great discussions, check out our Bipartisan Politics subreddit. You'll find the URL in the show notes. We've also got a Facebook page. That's facebook.com/politicsguys page. And we're on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, and Chris Wilkerson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show next week. We hope you'll join us.